Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of Building Bridges with Greg and Jill. We're glad to be back with a new month and a new podcast. We have two special guests that are going to join us by Zoom. And when we get to the point of introducing them, I think you'll want to stick around for the conversation. But beforehand, we want to welcome you to the month of November as we head into the holiday seasons, if you can believe it. We're heading towards Thanksgiving and Christmas and all the festivities that usually entails with family and friends, and sometimes not. It can be also a lonely time for folks who don't have family or friends nearby. So, but we are heading into the holidays nonetheless, and we wish you and yours a blessed Thanksgiving time and Christmas time as you begin to prepare for that. And hopefully, if you are a single person, that you have some time to reach out and to ask others to be involved in your Thanksgiving time or your Christmas time. So that's a possibility. We wish you that opportunity. So anyways, we do want you to know that when you like and share and subscribe, that helps us out. We appreciate you doing that, so we always mention that. And love your comments and feedback, because I think we are going to have the kind of conversation that will elicit some feedback and some thoughts and some ideas from you. So by all means, comment below, and we'll do our best to respond and answer to those things. But before we introduce our guests, I always like to say, Jill, welcome to our podcast. Would you like to say anything to the folks that listen in or watch in through YouTube?
Hi, I'm looking forward to this discussion today. It should be great. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, but we have known these men for a number of years. One a little longer. We are going all the way down to the Deep South with Kyle Beshears, and I can call him Dr. Pastor Kyle Beshears from Alabama, from the Mobile, Alabama area, where he is a faculty member at the Mobile Christian University, I think religion faculty, adjunct, I think, and then he is also a teaching pastor at Mars Hills Church. So before we introduce our second guest, Kyle, welcome to the program. Glad you could be with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Was that bio correct?
So I haven't been teaching at University of Mobile.
Well, I thought you did teach there. No,
I do.
Okay.
I do, but I've redirected focus because I've kind of put a lot of my efforts into a book I'm writing that would be interesting to the audience, 40 Questions About Mormonism.
Okay,
so
yes.
Between teaching and pastoring and writing, I had to set one down temporarily to pick the other up.
But from where you're sitting, it looks like you're in your pastor's study. Is that correct?
This is actually my home study.
Oh, your home study. It has really cool old books in it, that's for sure. So then we head a little bit south from where we're at, but not deep south where Kyle's at, to Provo, BYU campus. Dr. Stephan Taeger. Did I say that right? Taeger?
Yes, sir, you did, yes.
Yeah, no R. So there's Stephan. When we first met Stephan, he was involved with the Church Education System Teaching Institute down at the Orem Institute. And in this last year, he was hired at BYU to join their faculty. So he's just starting, if I'm not mistaken, his second year of teaching at BYU. Yeah.
Yes, sir, that's correct. Yep.
Welcome to our show. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Greg and Jill. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah. Well, why we thought it would be great to have you guys, because our podcast is it definitely has an emphasis on LDS evangelical relationships. There's no doubt about that. We're filming from Utah. That is our passion. That is what we've been doing as a couple and as a ministry, standing together for 22 years now. So we definitely focus on that, but we also involve other points of view and different conversational kinds of people, interviews and things like that. But we're back to a Latter-day Saint evangelical discussion, and each of you represent a kind of a new voice, a new level of leadership in what I would call the evangelical academic Latter-day Saint dialogue, where you guys as scholars are building relationship, and you're nuancing or crafting rather a friendship, not in spite of your differences, but with your differences in mind. You know that you have differences and similarities. And Stephan, I know that we're going to ask you both to kind of introduce yourselves a little bit with your background, but like what you did to prepare for your academic credentials and degree, what you studied was fascinating to me, the area of homiletics and Christian preaching. So let's set the stage first, right, Jill, and ask each of you to kind of basically give us a little background to who you are and where you're at right now in terms of the area of interest in the evangelical Latter-day Saint conversation And let's start with Stephan.
Sure. So just briefly, I teach at BYU. I teach Book of Mormon and New Testament, and my area of research focuses on homiletics, particularly narrative homiletics, which is I'm really interested in how story structure and stories can help convey the message of the gospel more powerfully. And because of that, I've listened to a lot of traditional Christian sermons, and I just love hearing a powerful message about Jesus and the scriptures. And as far as dialogue goes, I'm just interested in talking about the New Testament and Christianity and Christ and God. And I often find that when I talk with traditional Christians, we like some the same books and same thinkers and same writers. And so it just feels very natural for me to talk with evangelicals or other traditional Christians about religion and about faith.
Yeah. Excellent. And so where did you get your degree, Stephan?
Yeah, so my PhD is actually from BYU, and it's in instructional psychology. There's not any formal homiletics training in my tradition. And so I did it in instructional psychology, which is basically the psychology of learning. But then I just wrote about and studied really just homiletics and preaching. And I focused a lot on sort of late 20th century homiletics, that kind of thing. So
yeah. And before we jump to you, Kyle, I know that, Stephan, we've talked about one of the famous evangelical homiletics professors, and examples would be Dr. Haddon Robinson, who passed away just a couple years ago. I was privileged to be a student when he was the president of Denver Seminary back in the late 80s and early 90s. And then he moved on to Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary to do the Ockenga Chair of Preaching there. So here's a man that I know you've studied. You've read his book, The Big Idea of Preaching. But he spanned a career of probably 40-plus years at three major institutions: Dallas Seminary, Denver Seminary, and Gordon Conwell Seminary. And his whole focus was to help men and women preach better sermons, teach better sermons, learn the art and craft of being a speaker, a preacher. Some of our listeners might not know the term homiletics, but it's the art of preaching or teaching or speaking, So it was a privilege to know him, to read his book, and to kind of prepare for the ministry myself under his guidance. And one of the great examples of the Evangelical Latter-day Saint dialogue way back a long time ago in Boston, we actually had lunch. Robert Millett and myself had lunch with Dr. Robinson at a little restaurant not far from the campus, because I knew Dr. Robinson, and Dr. Robinson's brother-in-law was a Latter-day Saint out in Portland, Oregon, and so he had a curiosity, as his wife did, with that relationship. And so we sat down, and one of the first questions that Dr. Robinson asked Dr. Robert Millett, former Dean of Religion, author of many LDS books, says, "Now, Bob, in our tradition, we prepare our young pastors to really think about preaching and teaching and speaking. Now, I've listened in on some of your general conferences, and it's a little different. There's a kind of a style that I've picked up. Sometimes it's a little bit more monotone, a little bit more quiet, and I don't see much difference. Is there the freedom to kind of have a different preaching style?" So we had an interesting conversation about preaching way back before you even were a scholar on this topic. But that was a fascinating conversation, because Bob said, "I know we have a different style among our general authorities, and that's just part of the cultural, difference, I guess." So anyways.
Yeah, a lot of the, I'm obviously aware of Dr. Robinson. I haven't had a chance to dive too much into his work. I'm aware of his major work. In fact, it's often listed as one of the most influential books in preaching, but most of the preaching I've studied is actually mainline homiletics. And so the evangelical preacher that's really influenced the way I think about homiletics is actually Tim Keller.
Okay.
That's, as far as evangelical side of traditional Christianity, that's the person I've really dove into and studied and tried to, learn a lot about their method. He's one of the best communicators of the Christian faith easily in the last 50 years, no question.
And sadly, just passed away with pancreatic cancer just several months ago. So we miss him already. So, because he, like you said, he was a gifted teacher and theologian for us. So, Kyle, let's move over to the Deep South for a minute here and ask you to tell us a little bit about your background and why you have an interest in this area of discussion. of theology.
Sure, yeah. Well, welcome to the Deep South. If I don't sound like I'm originally from here, it's because I'm not. I'm originally from the Chicagoland area, but I've been ministering and pastoring for the past 10 years at a church here in Mobile. The connection between Stephan and I is this: if Stephan likes to study homiletics, sermons that are teaching about Jesus, I like to preach them. So that is my primary role in my church, is to preach and to teach. And that's kind of how Stephan and I hit it off. I've had a long interest in the Latter-day Saint faith and tradition. I did my PhD work in Mormon history, and I've got a handful of articles, a book coming out next year related to LDS beliefs and practices and history. I was just in Logan presenting a paper at the Book of Mormon Studies Association, which was a lot of fun. Met a lot of old friends, made a lot of new ones that I consider colleagues in that field. And I've been in the dialogue kind of world for the past, I suppose it's 8 years now. I've been active in partnering with universities here in Mobile and with you two, standing together, bringing some of our college students from our church out to participate in interfaith dialogues all up and down the valley, sometimes even up there in Utah, or Logan.
Up in Logan, yeah. Just again, for the sake of our audience and those listening, Standing Together started in March of 2001, and I'm gonna get you into this conversation here, Jill, in just a minute. But when we started, we met a young man from Colorado Christian University named Eric McHenry. Right during the Olympics. And he was aware through his connections in Colorado with Dr. Craig Blomberg, was the co-author of the book, How Wide the Divide, with Dr. Stephen Robinson at BYU. And he basically came to me during the Olympics and said, hey, what you're doing with scholars, could we not do that with students, university students? Because I'd love to bring a group of students from Colorado Christian over here. And I said, well, we haven't really thought of it, but I don't know why we couldn't. I have some connections at BYU, so let's see if we can knock on that door and get an invitation, And so we did, and that was our first dialogue, was in spring of 2003. So we've been going every year since then, involving a number of schools pretty consistently, with a few that come and go over the last, 20 plus years now. And so we've enjoyed this dialogue experience that has really kind of been tested many times over with university students from places like Biola or Westmont College or Azusa Pacific University, Wheaton College, Abilene Christian, Mobile Christian University, students from colleges like, from church groups like Mars Hill, as well as Yorba Linda Friends. So we've been able to establish this presence with the LDS Church, permitting us to come to BYU first, then to a variety of institutes of religion, starting at Logan, moving down into Salt Lake, then up to Weber, and down to Utah Valley. And now we do meetings also in St. George, as well as Cedar City, with the blessing of the LDS Church, the Church Education System, and Elder Clark Gilbert, who's the Commissioner of Education. So your entrance into this, Kyle, was that you came with your church group, your Rusty, I'm spacing his last name, Roberts. I was about to say an old high school friend named Rusty. Anyways, he came with the school, I think, a time or two, and then you started to join the group. And it's been an interesting thing, because when your students come, from the South and from their worldview and perspective, it's a little different than the California University student. There's some kind of nuance there, and it's a great experience for the BYU students and the Institute students to interact with evangelical college students from different parts of the country, frankly. That's a great experience for them. So when you popped into that and began to come and attend and faithfully involved, like you said, these last 8 years, what was your initial observation of what was going on, and then why did you become such a strong supporter of it?
Yeah, I'll be honest. At first, I was a little skeptical or wary of that type of an interaction. I didn't quite understand what I was seeing. When I think about dialogue today, dialogue coming from two words in Greek meaning to speak across, or two people speaking across. What are they speaking across? It's a chasm, or differences, or disagreements. And so I wondered to myself, like what can college students at that level, on both sides of the fence, frankly, speak to? I mean, they're just at this point in their life, they've just left the homes that they grew up in. As a pastor, like, there are people in my church that frankly, if I was to say, like, hey, go to Utah and have a theological conversation, I would be sweating bullets until they came home. Not to say that they're wrong or there's something less about them, but if you go through proper theological education, you have those kinds of concerns. But it wasn't until like the second or third year that I started to really see fruit blossom, not only in the lives and the maturity and the kind of under the self-awareness or self-understanding of our students' beliefs, but also genuine friendships and a bridge being built across that chasm that word dialogue comes from. And it was those matured results that I saw occurring on, we can call that maybe a bridge between those two, that really hooked me. And I've been sold ever since. I'm a major advocate of this kind of dialogue.
Yeah, and I know, I know. Are you prepared to ask a question? Do you have something you have in mind for to bring Stephan in? I just want to say, for about a year or two, or maybe 3 or 4, I don't know how long it was, you were kind of quiet on the group, and I had this perception that maybe you weren't a fan and that you were, not happy with this. And it took me like 2 or 3 years, I don't know why, but I remember having kind of a breakthrough conversation with you, and I'm like, oh, you approve of this. This is wonderful. It was great to know because you're kind of stoic, you're a scholar, and you kind of keep your cards close to your chest there. So I didn't know if you were a fan or not. But I really have to say that your students from Mars Hill and from Mobile University and the other universities there, and Rusty's leadership and others, that you guys have brought a really great group of students, for a number of years, and have been really an important part of the dialogue process.
Yeah, your students are well prepared. It's been good. I would like to ask Stephan to jump in here and let us know what the two of you are doing on a scholarly level.
Or beginning to do, yeah.
Or beginning to do.
As far as dialogue goes, or just in general?
Yes, yeah.
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
Yes, as far as dialogue goes and how you've taken this into the scholarly world.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm glad that you're framing it like that, Jill, because obviously I don't speak officially for the church, and I don't hold any ecclesiastical authority in the Latter-day Saint tradition. And so I really do try to frame this from more of as a scholarly exercise, or something that would benefit our students. And in fact, that's the primary way that, as far as how the dialogue has manifested between Kyle and I, is I've helped coordinate some of these students coming over. They've actually been into my home, I think, twice now. Mm-hmm. We'd like to continue to do that. I'm involved with the Interfaith Student Association here on campus, and so I'm just starting to get more involved in that. There has been talks and meetings, or at least one meeting with some traditional Christians, evangelicals, and Latter-day Saints, and we've tried to sort of plan out and talk about what will the future look like in the evangelical and Latter-day Saint dialogue. What does that look like? And then Kyle and I are just constantly, just informally dialoguing all the time through text and phone calls. And I'll say, Kyle, you got to explain this to me about the Trinity again, or whatever it is, or canonization or whatever. And so there's just this ongoing sort of scholarly dialogue that way as well. But we're kind of at a crossroads where the future sort of open. About the future of the Latter-day Saint evangelical dialogue. What will that be like? What will that look like? A lot of the original people who are foundational in setting up this dialogue, I think in some ways are ready to pass on the reins to get other people involved. And some who are a part of that original dialogue are still going to be a part of it. And so we'll see what the future holds. But I think it's really important that we keep going, that we keep dialoguing, that we find new things to dialogue about, and that we've build relationships and just try to do more good and work on worthy causes together.
Yeah. Having been a part of the previous group myself and working closely with Robert Millett and Rich Mao from Fuller Seminary, that formal dialogue actually launched in May of 2000. So, and then it went kind of forward all the way to the May area of 2014. At that time, there was a decision to kind of stop that group to finish it because we had kind of exhausted a lot of topics. And then a smaller subset with a little bit different focus kind of reemerged in 2015 and then concluded in 2020. Actually, right before COVID is when it concluded. And they had a meeting or two at the end of that, and then a celebration event at BYU that was hosted by the Robert Millett and a few of the BYU faculty, so we could kind of conclude that first tier or that first run at this that lasted literally from May of 2000 to 20 up to 2022, and those relationships do exist. But a number of them of the original participants have actually passed away. People like David Paulson has passed away, and I'm thinking of he was in church history at BYU. He passed away with cancer. I can just see his face. His dear friend, passed away in 2007. So that goes way back. But anyways, it'll come up to me in a minute. But so I think that you guys do represent an opportunity for kind of a next level, a next generation of younger scholars beginning to meet. The thing I think that's most against you is that you don't have the funding the mechanism that Bob Millett and Rich Mao could tap into. So we've got to get some interested donors who believe in this work to kind of start infusing your efforts with some funding so you can travel and meet and be in proximity. That would the old group used to meet twice a year, once at AAR SBL and once independently of that, either at Fuller Seminary or at BYU. We go back and forth. So it was really a grand experiment and a really fruitful experience. So Kyle, we've got about 2 or 3 minutes. So let me ask you one last question, Stephan. What would be your hope or your why do you feel BYU students, other LDS students from the institutes, why do you think it's a good thing for them to be engaged in this kind of conversation with traditional Christians and evangelical students?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question, and it's an important question. First and foremost, we have a faith commitment to see others, to love others as ourselves, and to see other children of God as image bearers of God, and to show respect to them and to learn about them and try to understand them. So first, it's a theological commitment just to love our neighbor, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is that Kyle and I, we definitely are okay with differences, and we're not just trying to say, look, all religions are all the same, some kind of watered down everything. It's all just sit around the campfire and everyone just be happy. No, like there are real strong, serious theological differences in our traditions, and talking through them and explaining them, especially for students, helps them to clarify and understand those even more. And so I after dialogues, I remember a student called me and said, well, okay, now wait a minute. What do we think about grace, and how do we make sense of that? Right. Yeah. And I've talked to people after dialogues who have brought up the sovereignty of God and the differences that we have there and what that looks like. And so there are a few things that will help a student clarify their own belief than having to explain it. And what's great about dialogue is it's not a debate. It's not contentious. No one's trying to win. We're simply trying to get to clarity and understanding. And when we do that, that helps us to really strengthen our own foothold in our own traditions. And then also see maybe where there's some areas where we're not that different, where we can at least work together on worthy causes, right?
Yeah. Real quick, I know we maybe have a couple minutes. You have to head to class. Some of the critics of the dialogue, whether it be with scholars or students or even general authorities and evangelical leaders across the country, which we've worked over these last 22 years on all 3 of those levels, and some really exciting things are happening right now between general authority level leadership with evangelical leadership nationally that is kind of in the works and in soon to be happening and soon to be developing. But one of the criticisms is, this is just soft core evangelism. You're really trying to sway us. We're trying to sway you. There's not really an interest in bridge building and friendship. This is a nice way of trying to, take people from one side to the other. I don't agree with that sentiment. I just wonder if you could speak to that real quick before you step out of the conversation.
Yeah, if it ever did become that, I would not be interested in it at all, right? It can't become that on either side. It really has to be about building friendships, understanding, and strengthening one within their own tradition, right? It has to be about that, and clarity, and just and trying to get to that clarity. And there are things we can do to sort of prevent that kind of thing from happening. In fact, when Kyle brings students over to Utah, he does a fantastic job at sort of training them, making sure that they're the kind of person that's ready for a dialogue. And so I think that's one of the things that we can do is say, hey, here are some ground rules, here are some boundaries. We can prep students on the basics of maybe I would like to see this more, is prep students on some basic theological terms, that kind of thing. And then that way it's not sort of, oh, look, we have a hidden agenda, right?
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
you know, as disciples of Christ, it's our responsibility to love our neighbor and try to understand them, right?
It's very hard to love someone that you never spend time with, never talk to, never interact with. And I love the fact that you finished your part with us on that note, because I used to say with Bob Millett up front on stage in front of audiences, whether or not we consider ourselves enemies to each other as Latter-day Saints and evangelicals, or whether we consider ourselves friends, Jesus said we have to love each other nonetheless. So whether we're enemies or friends, we have to love each other. And that means we have to treat each other in a way that we, the other side of that discussion, feel loved. And if the person you say you love never feels like you love them very much, you're not very loving to them, they have a reason to say, hey, I'm not sure this dialogue is all about love, and or at least is motivated or founded on the principles of love. And it's very easy then to pull back and say, hey, I'm not interested in this because I just feel like you're attacking me, so yeah. But I wish you could stay longer, but we know you have to leave. But we're gonna finish up with Kyle here, so we don't have to end right away. But thanks so much for joining us, and we'll probably have you back for another time.
I'd love that. Thank you so much, everyone. It's great seeing you. I really
Blessings.
appreciate it. And thanks for all you do, you guys, to keep these dialogues going. Thank you so much.
Kyle, Jill.
Kyle, I would love for you to just expand a little bit. Stephan was talking about some differences. And I know that a lot of times when we have differences with people, it's really hard to continue having a relationship. But do you have a philosophy or a way of dealing with some of the differences? And what does that look like?
Yeah, there's a lot there, because when it comes to the history of both of our movements, there's been a lot of contention, and that's putting it mildly. Presently, both evangelical impulses towards mission are strikingly similar to Latter-day Saint impulses towards mission, which is to train up, send out, to preach a message, and to convert. And so both of our traditions are conversionary people, right? We would like to see people come to the movement that we consider true and beautiful and meaningful. So just understanding both of those things, kind of the historical context and the present context from which you come, is really important. I think the second thing, and this is what Stephan kind of hinted at, was not to set aside differences. If you're never going to talk about differences, you're never going to really truly understand the person across from you. And of course, baked into the Greatest Commission, as we've been orbiting, is to love your neighbor as yourself. And so how can you really love somebody like yourself if you don't know them? Or worse, you think you know them, but it's actually a caricature of who they are, where they came from, what they believe, and what they do. The analogy I use, I liken to it, is a couple that's dating and prepared to be engaged. And then married. If they went on 30 dates and all they ever talked about was what they agreed on, they're in for a rude awakening when they have their first disagreement in their marriage, and they're probably going to be in a pastor's or a counselor's office seeking marital counseling. And a lot of that can be alleviated if you just actually knew who it was that you were entering into this deep, meaningful relationship with.
That's really good.
So I think that's important. But mostly, I think that Jesus provides us a model in John chapter 4, when he approaches a Samaritan woman at the well. That you could even see there was tension between in that first century, the Jews and the Samaritans over what is closer to truth, who is in closer proximity to proper worship of God. And Jesus refused to enter into that conversation, even though he was a Jew, and I think would have very strong disagreements with Samaritan theology. He had very strong disagreements with Jewish practices as well, famously with scribes and Pharisees. So what he does is he points her to him. And so the goal of the dialogue is not to debate, should we go to the temple in Samaria or Jerusalem? The goal of the dialogue is how do we help each other grow in proximity towards truth, to magnify and glorify the Lord Jesus Christ. And this is one of the things that when I'm offered the opportunity to kind of set the stage for student dialogues, that's my go-to analogy, and that's my go-to recommendation, is how do we together honor Jesus in our conversations.
Yeah. Well, that is just so good, and such a good summation of the process and the legitimacy of this conversation. As you said, and our audience knows that I was raised in the LDS faith and have a childhood, young teenage year history in my LDS Mormon faith. But as I came into an evangelical tradition, in fact, I had the privilege of talking with somebody just very recently about how, when I first came to faith in Christ, and people learned that I was a former Latter-day Saint back in 1980 and 81 at the age of 14 and a half, almost 15, I felt almost like a star, like, hey, we got one of them, and they would put me up in front, tell us your story, how you came to know Jesus and how you left that other thing. And I realized that in time that I was more of a victory chip, or a trophy, and I said, well, I don't necessarily want to be a trophy. I want to have relationships. And I was involved in what was called classically, kind of counter religious apologetics. The phrase that evangelicals would use back then is counter cult apologetics. And I did that because that's what we did in the 80s and 90s. And then I came to Utah as a pastor in 1992. And I said, the thing that's really wrong about that model is the people that I really love the most and want to have a relationship with and know that I love them and want them to love me back are people that they're LDS people who we have disagreements, and they think that I hate them. They think that I am opposed to them. And certainly evangelicals have their own stories, particularly here in Utah, of mistreatment by Latter-day Saints who didn't include them and excluded them and their children and all kinds of things. We had this long history of antagonism that somehow, I think in the late 90s, begins to blossom into maybe we can do this better. And so some people have been uncomfortable with it, particularly early on. But like you said, I think that marriage illustration, if all you ever talk about is the agreements, then gosh, when you get married, you're going to have some rude awakening. But what this conversation allows us to do is to have the conversations with students, with scholars, and not be afraid, not be, fearful that this is going to, we're going to lose some to them or they're going to lose some to us. It's really more about loving one another than it is about being fearful, and I think you really see that as well, don't you? I mean, is that, yeah.
I do. And the flip side of that analogy is if all you ever talk about is your disagreements.
Okay.
Right.
Good.
And you never talk about what you agree on. Well, we've had plenty of that. And that carries on very strongly and echoes very loudly in our relationship today. That's a pretty easy thing to do, to be frank.
Yeah.
But it doesn't get anywhere, frankly. And I think it's a salient point that you make, that about the 1990s is when things start to shift. I sense the same thing. Growing up in the other restoration movement, so the Stone Campbell movement, my kind of foray into Mormonism was a little rocky. I was shown the God Makers the film in middle school in our youth group. When I wanted to learn more about the Latter-day Saint faith and tradition, they gave me Kingdom of the Cults. And I think this is a pretty common in the 90s and late 80s. It's a pretty common introduction for evangelicals to Mormonism, to the Latter-day Saints. And it wasn't until I started to grow up and grow a genuine interest, not strictly in the religion, but in the people, in the adherents, the men and the women, the children, the grandmas, the grandpas, the coworkers, the service members, right? I wanted to know those people that I realized I think I started on the wrong foot. And that kind of pushed me into really, I want to see the math on their history. I want to really know not just what they believe, but who they are as people. And then the deeper I got into that, the more of I feel like a genuine love
Yeah.
right? It's what Jesus is getting at, like a genuine love for the friends that I've made across the divide, so to speak.
Yeah.
I like that you
go ahead.
brought up that, Jesus was a Jew, and when he came in, he didn't agree with all the things that the Jewish religious leaders were doing, and he set a different example. And just based on that, I wonder if you could tell us if there is something that you feel like you've learned from your LDS friends that maybe changed some of your traditional thinking, or maybe a cultural thing that you were involved in being in evangelicalism, that you realized, wow, the LDS really understand this on a level that I haven't understood this before.
Yeah, there's a few things. I'll say at first there were some things that when I started studying Latter-day Saint theology or doctrine, it actually pushed me deeper into like a traditional Christian position. For example, Trinitarianism. So perhaps to the chagrin or disappointment, I feel like I've actually become more Trinitarian in studying Latter-day Saint doctrine. But there three areas in particular that I have been challenged by Latter-day Saints have been and the way they organize as an institution and mobilize missions. And I'm not talking just proselytizing or evangelizing. I'm talking about poverty relief or disaster relief. It's so impressive. It's so impressive, and it makes me wish that there was something equivalent across the board. Now, certain denominations, large Protestant denominations, have those kinds of mechanisms, but not at the level that the Latter-day Saint Church has. And so I've been very impressed anytime that I've been around that area. As far as like practices or life is concerned, the emphasis of the family unit and the promotion of the family unit has been a breath of fresh air, I think, especially in the direction that our culture goes, where family is not central. It's maybe ancillary to you as an individual. If your family is going to help you get to where you want to go, that's great. But if not, don't bother. That is not the case for Latter-day Saints, of course. Now, they have theological reasons for that I disagree with, but they also have cultural reasons for it that I can't disagree with. And they've challenged me and pushed me in that way. And so I'm grateful for them for that. And there was a third one as well, but it just slipped my mind. Maybe it'll come back later. It was a doctrinal or a theological position. But yeah, for starters, I think those two would be good examples.
It was interesting, and I think I'd like to ask you to help us think through, from a theological point of view, how we even come to our convictions and how we come to believe what we believe. In philosophy and theology, this is called epistemology, the area of how do we know what we know is actually true or not true? How do we know it? And I think Bob Millet and I, as by way of an illustration, we would travel together for a number of years. We traveled together, and we would have these roadside conversations, as we're traveling from one event to another, landing in an airport and getting a rental car and driving a ways to a speaking engagement. And he'd say, now, Greg, you're a theological guy, and you know about the Trinity, and you know about inerrancy, and you know about salvation by grace alone, and you know about the sin nature and all that. But let's imagine there's just a faithful, godly woman that might lived in my neighborhood in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She's not educated. She couldn't even say philosophy or epistemology. She probably doesn't think a whole lot about the Trinity or inerrancy, or she just knows Jesus and her Bible. And is that enough to save her? Is that enough to? And I'd say yes, of course. I'd say yes. She has a pure and simple faith, absolutely. And he said, but you don't accept my declaration of faith, because I also say that I'm trusting in Jesus, but then you disagree with some of the things that I add on to that. So how do you have a right as an evangelical to tell me that what I know and how I know it is not legitimately Christianity as opposed to your form of Christianity? And so this area we used to refer to this little old lady who's just a simple Christian, and how she could be truly saved. But Bob Millett, this theologian from BYU, who has a deep, sophisticated knowledge of these theological categories, from a traditional Christian point of view, could not be saved. And so we go back and forth on this. How do we manage something so kind of prickly as that big question, as epistemology, and because our Mormon friends, our Latter-day Saint friends, usually have a high view of testimony, of more of a subjective experience, where traditional Christians will tend to be more doctrinaire, and it's got to be in the Bible, it's got to be in the Word, it's got to be, verse by. So talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think fundamentally, and the starting point for me is the fact that I am no person's judge at all, right? Like I don't know who God wills to save and who he does not save. What I'm told is that you have been saved, you've been given a message, preach it. For those that claim to be a follower of Jesus, there are certain fruit that you should see in their life, but to condemn or to affirm somebody's eternal salvation is for no man or no woman to determine, because essentially what you're telling Jesus Christ is, you don't have to do that whole great white throne judgment thing. I've got you covered. So I think it's a healthy dose of humility is where you have to begin. Now, second, how do we know that the epistemological question? It's such a good one. And Latter-day Saints and evangelicals come from radically different viewpoints on this, which I think you're talking about authority now. Mm-hmm. I think authority is where most, if not all, of the source of our disagreement comes from. So for Latter-day Saints that may be listening in, traditional Christians, and I have to subset that to Protestantism because I can't speak for Roman Catholics or Eastern Orthodoxy. We have kind of a tiered level of authority. At the very highest top is Scripture and our interpretation of Scripture. This doctrine is called sola scriptura. It doesn't mean the Bible only or the Bible alone, but it means the Bible atop. So any sermon, any thought, any systematic theology has to submit its veracity to Scripture, especially very plain things that are spoken in Scripture. There is a second and third level and kind of nature to how we know, and that is tradition and subjective experience with God. I think tradition, what have theologians thought in the past, right? So if you meet an evangelical and you ask them, who's your favorite theologian? It's probably going to be some guy from Europe, from the Reformation to about like the 19th century, right? I love Charles Spurgeon. I love John Calvin or John Knox. I love John Wesley. I love Martin Luther. And so whether we know it or not, or whether we like it or not, we're drawing on a tradition. Mm-hmm. But again, that tradition has to submit to Scripture. And then third is that subjective inner feeling, like God does speak to us. His word is living and active. When you read Scripture and God confirms to you in a very supernatural, metaphysical way, that's not something to discount. And I think that for a lot of evangelicals, it makes people uncomfortable because how can you verify it? Well, that's a great question. Again, straight to the top, sola scriptura. For Latter-day Saints, it's different. Latter-day Saints have authority in a canon, which is the Christian Bible, Old and New Testament, but a canon that's expanded, which includes all of the standard works, Pearl of Great Price, Book of Mormon, and Doctrine and Covenants, which Protestants do not accept. They do have internal subjective confirmation of spiritual truth, which is something that we share with them. So there's not a whole lot there. I think that's different. It's just how much emphasis do you place on that kind of source of knowledge? And then third, they have the priesthood, who for the highest earthly authority are the general authorities and atop the living prophet and his counselors. And so Protestants do not, well, I like to say cheekily, we do have a living prophet. His name is Jesus, and he'll come back and we'll get to ask him all the questions we've ever wanted to ask him. Our living prophet is currently making all things new at the right hand of his Father. But Latter-day Saints say, yeah, we agree with that, but we also have an actual contemporary prophet on earth, because this is how God has ordained his church to be. And so they draw a lot from General Conference. They draw a lot from kind of quasi-official statements, official declarations, or even in the future, hypothetically, because the canon is open, Doctrine and Covenants could expand, right? There could be a revelation from God that is given to the prophet, is received by the church and added to their canon as well. That is not the case for Protestants. And so you can already see, running through a number of different kinds of scenarios, how not only would we disagree, but we would almost lack the ability to understand each other, because our sources of authority and how we understand and verify what we know are pretty different. And so that's part of the piece of dialogue that's important, not only to understand how you know what you know, or at least how do you believe you know what you know, but also how does the person sitting across the table from you believe what they believe and know what they know. Great question.
Because sometimes that lack of understanding can lead to a lot of conflict that is not really intended, because it would be like trying, I think, to speak to a person of a foreign language, someone in China about, who speaks Chinese, and I'm from America and I speak English, and we may know a few words of each other's language, and we may try our best to kind of, piece that together and hi and bye and that kind of stuff. But, we're really limited in our ability to understand each other because we just don't share a common language. And even this epistemology area, we can tend to be kind of suspect of each other's epistemology or their view of how they know what they know, and then take it lightly or kind of, maybe dismiss it or be uncharitable to it, because, the power of testimony is something that we both, as Latter-day Saints and evangelicals, share. A testimony given at a monthly fast and testimony meeting from an LDS person is their expression of a sincere belief based on an experience or circumstances that they've embraced. And we have those things, but again, how we check and balance and counter those things, the LDS Church would say, you check that with the authority, with the senior priesthood leader. I mean, if a bishop hears something said that's not appropriate in a ward house, he has the right and the authority to correct that in that moment. Or, as it goes higher up, a stake president or a regional representative or a general authority, and ultimately to the Quorum of the 12 in the first presidency. So we really have to be sensitive and humble, like you said, to approach one another with saying, hey, their way of looking at this, I have to understand how they look at this in order to have a healthy conversation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What role does question asking have in that?
Yes. Question asking in dialogue is everything. It's everything when it comes to communication, right? I like to tell our students, and I use this rule myself, there is no wrong question to ask. There's just a wrong way to ask it. And further, there is a wrong motivation to ask the question, even if you're asking it in the right way. So I think, first of all, like the question that you're going to ask has to be rooted in a genuine heart. It needs to be articulated well. But to me, there should be no topic offhand or that's out of bounds. Because again, if we're trying to really understand each other, we should be able to ask each other anything. It's just, how are you asking it and why are you asking it? So having at least a rudimentary understanding of topics that your Latter-day Saint, from our perspective to yours, or from Latter-day Saints to evangelicals, topics that they might be comfortable speaking with freely, or topics that they might be uncomfortable speaking about freely. Be sensitive to that and understand that. Maybe there's certain things that you want to talk about, but it's going to take some trust. Like we start, as faith traditions, we start in a deficit of trust. Like when you're coming to a dialogue with a Latter-day Saint, you have no clue, but you are bringing pounds and pounds of baggage with you. If you're aware of it, then it's even more terrifying of a burden to understand that. Right. So phrase the question well, and ask the question with the right motivation. I think somebody said it earlier, that sometimes there's dialogue is put under suspicion because, well, this is just, what did you say, Greg? Like
a soft
pseudo-
evangelism, a soft
soft
level
evangelism.
of
I've also heard it like stealth evangelism. There's always an ulterior motive, and well, then that means that the person across the table from you is not actually a person; it's a project. It's a project you're trying to prod, dissect, and fix according to your own image of what you think is right. And people aren't dumb. People pick up on that very quickly. And any semblance of trust that you may have had at the beginning of the conversation is now evaporated completely. So it's not just enough to have a good, neighborly, lovingly phrased question. You also need to have the right motivation in asking the question as well.
Yeah, I really like how you've added that second part. You know, there's no such thing as a wrong question, but a wrong way of asking it, but also a wrong motivation for asking it. And I will incorporate that more into my language, because I think there is that thing. Dr. Craig Blomberg used to get questions like, well, how do you know that the person you're talking to is being honest with you and telling you the real thing, or they're giving you a kind of a watered down version in public, but they believe differently or more intensely something else, you know? And he said, you know, I think in every human relationship we have, we build trust and we lose trust with people. But if you're in conversation with people and you're authentically having conversation and you're building trust and you're building a relationship, at some point you have to choose, is this guy just lying to me, or is this guy, you know, being as honest as he can from his perspective? And at some point, you wouldn't be able to do that in the first 5 minutes of a conversation, but you should be able to do that, you know, weeks and months and, you know, maybe half a year or, you know, a year's worth of time where you go, you know, I don't think this person is lying, and that I need to continually be suspicious that there's no integrity in this conversation. There are probably some movements that are intensely deceptive that way. I don't think what we find in the LDS evangelical dialogue community that is a rampant problem. I think that most Latter-day Saints, and there really has been, and they would admit that, particularly here in Utah, that Mormonism has, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has been exposed to a greater audience. It's a worldwide faith. It has to interact beyond the borders of Utah. It can't just have a small-mindedness about it. It has to have an open-mindedness and be a part of the larger conversations of different religions and worldviews and ideas. So I think that, you know, when you're talking to a university student, you might be talking to a fellow scholar, or, like I said, maybe a congregational leader or a national leader. There's a lot of authenticity that I think is being built into this, that we've gained that. I mean, the only reason that they let students come to the different institutes of religion or to BYU is because I think, and when we, the Standing Together ministry that Jill and I provide leadership to our knowledge, we're the only authorized organization to kind of make these arrangements and open up these experiences. I'm not saying that others haven't had them, but we have been given that because they trust us, because they think that we have a decent attitude and approach to this. It's not deceptive. It's not stealth. It's not, you know, with a nefarious plan. But they also let us talk about the differences too. And I think if they were to say, yeah, you can come in, but don't talk about any theology, we wouldn't come. But they've given us that freedom. And I think that speaks to the trust and the humility of trusting one another that is so critical. If that's constantly violated, that's another thing. But I don't think that, you know, going way back to 2004 when Ravi Zacharias spoke at the Mormon Tabernacle in Temple Square, as it used to be called, now it's the Tabernacle in Temple Square, when he spoke there was so much suspicion about why they, the Latter-day Saint Church, allowed this meeting to be held. You know, we were the conveners of the meeting. And I would get that from a lot of pastors. Well, Greg, you know they have an agenda. There's no way that they would let you do this if they didn't have their agenda, and you're playing into that agenda. And I said, you know what? I just think it's a really cool thing that they're letting us come and have our guests speak in their facility, and that will make a lot of Latter-day Saints comfortable to come and listen and participate and not feel threatened by it. And there'll be a certain kind of a tacit approval by the leadership that it's okay to come and hear this guy speak, you know. So we gained that kind of feedback, and the the bottom line is literally the Friday before the Sunday that Ravi spoke in the tabernacle with Ravi and Robert Millett, we got to meet with the LDS Church's first presidency, and Gordon B. Hinckley was the president at the time. And I couldn't let that meeting stop or finish. I didn't ask any other question but one. And I just said before the meeting ended, I said, President Hinckley, can I just ask one question? And he said, sure. And I said, as the convener of this meeting, a lot of people are very suspicious of this and wonder why you're letting, for the first time in over 100 years, an evangelical speaker come and give a sermon in the tabernacle, hadn't been done since D.L. Moody in late 1899. He said as simply as I can say it, shrugging his shoulders kind of like, he said, well, just seemed like a good idea. And I thought, we had pictured that they were sitting around some strategic board table, analyzing, thinking through, nuancing all this battle plan, And I wonder if it wasn't just that simple, that he just said, when it came to his attention, he just said, oh, that's a nice idea, I approve, and it wasn't any more thought through than that. At least he said so, and I took him at his word that it was just a good idea, it's a nice idea, let's just do it, and sometimes we're so, the baggage you talked about that we carry makes us very suspicious. So did you have another question, Jill?
I was wondering, Kyle, if you would let us know what your paper was that you presented in Logan. You mentioned it early in the podcast, and it's just been on my mind to hear about that.
Yeah, great question. So I mentioned earlier that I did my PhD. I did my PhD in religion, and then you have to write a dissertation, just super, super long paper, right? And I did my dissertation on the history of a breakaway group from the main Latter-day Saint movement under the leadership of a man named James Strang. And so any of the scholarly work that I do that relates to Mormon studies and then Latter-day Saint history in specific has to do with that group, whether it's history, its beliefs, biographies of its converts. And this paper just happened to be about a set of brass plates that James Strang said he discovered in the year after Joseph Smith was assassinated. And he used these plates and a translation of them to make a bid to take Joseph's place rather than Brigham Young or any of the other kind of contenders at that time. So not a lot is known about this episode, and I was just exploring how this episode was kind of received historically and its relationship to the Book of Mormon, if any at all.
That's very interesting. Yeah, how did they respond?
It was positively received. I'm hoping to work with somebody to do a little bit more work, and then maybe see some of both of our works in the light of day. We'll see. But it's such a fascinating part of the Latter-day Saint story that's often not known. And I understand why you're talking about a contender to Brigham Young. And any challenge to authority, even flip side from the position of like James Strang's followers to Brigham Young. Well, these are uncomfortable topics to talk about. But at the same time, understanding James Strang's story and the followers that he had gives you pretty keen insight into what a lot of Latter-day Saints at that time experienced, what they thought. Why didn't some go to Utah? Why did some stay in the Midwest? The knee-jerk reaction might be, well, they just rejected Brigham Young. Well, that's true, but a lot of them were also poor, and they couldn't make the journey. A lot of them were terrified of what it would mean to go live in a desert with a family of 5. And here you've got another guy says, why don't you just come up to Wisconsin with us? So it really kind of like humanizes Latter-day Saint history and tells those people's stories. So I'm actually mostly interested in the stories of his followers.
Well, and up until, I think this goes back to about 2015 when the LDS Church kind of closed their historical library or historical museum for about a year, maybe 6 months to a year, and they represented a lot of things, and they've included in the new church history museum a section on dissident followers, other groups, the Strangites, the what are they called? The
The Church of
Brickerites?
Jesus Christ, the Bickertonites, is
The
they're sometimes
Bickertonites.
called.
Yeah. And off the top of your head, because this is something more that you're involved with, how many groups came out of the LDS faith that didn't follow Brigham Young? Were there just a handful? Were there
From then to today?
Yeah. Well, how many would you?
Thousands.
Wow.
Thousands of separate
Thousands.
entities
Yes,
that would all claim.
break-offs of break-offs of break-offs. Yeah. So there's
Wow,
a
I
great
didn't know
book
that.
called by Stephen Shields that goes through all of the different lineages of all of the breakaway groups. But you have some main ones immediately after Joseph Smith. Famously, Sidney Rigdon takes a group, and that's where Bickerton comes into play later in that history. John Whitmer. You have James Strang, Alpheus Cutler. There's a lot of different men that stand up at that time and say, hey, I'm the prophet. But the dust kind of settles when there's in 1860, when Joseph Smith III is appointed the president over what would today be called the Community of Christ. But even then, you continue the story forward. There are breakaway groups from the Community of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And as your listeners probably are very well aware, there are many breakaway groups from the Utah Church. Some fundamental, some have fundamentalists, I should say. Some have prophets that pop up, and they make similar claims to Joseph Smith, and they draw people, or they gather people to themselves. So there are thousands.
The name of that book that you just mentioned, do you have a title of it?
Oh my goodness, it's in its 5th edition. I should know it. Stephen Shields, Divergent Paths, I believe.
Okay.
Divergent
Okay.
Paths of the Restoration.
Yeah, maybe
And
somebody
there's
would want to
another
read
one
that.
here. I only have Divergent Paths in digital form, so I can't pull it up. But there's another good one called Scattering of the Saints, and even kind of like the book cover suggests all of the different
Wow.
groups.
I had no
that spring
idea.
open.
That's
Yeah.
fascinating.
I think, again, sometimes our Latter-day Saint friends from the main LDS church in Salt Lake City based in will say, well, there's been so many different offshoots of Christianity, and there's so many different religions, and there's Baptists and Lutherans and Presbyterians and Methodists and this and that. And I think it says something about, in all honesty, that human beings, broken as we are,
Yes.
will find reasons to disagree, and then take those disagreements to certain levels, some of them being very, very, very toxic and very angry, and breaking away from family and friends and starting things new that are not healthy examples, sometimes necessary breakaways because of heresy and false teachings or whatever. So that the reality of what we live with today as Protestants, with I think over 32,000 different Protestant churches being identifiable through the IRS alone, that would claim to be Protestant churches. That's sad to me that we have that much, but we're not alone. There are many other examples.
I would say like schisms and denominalization is not a weapon to be wielded by either side,
Right.
because
Good point.
we have that issue on both sides of us. And your point's salient. It's not so much a doctrinal disagreement as maybe it is a pride thing, or a fallen human condition thing. And I think that you're right on the money when you say that. And this is something that's been happening since the very beginning, right? You have Paul having to correct the church at Corinth. Some of you are followers of Apollo, and others are Paul, and others are Peter, and others of Jesus. Like, where did we get off the rails? And he says, you know what? There must be factions among you.
Yeah.
So that we know who's genuine and who's not. Now,
Yeah.
repent and seek unity. So this is not I don't think this is a church institutional issue. This is a human heart issue.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, a lot to take in today. We've enjoyed our time with you. Sorry that we had to leave Stephan. He had to run to class, of course. But I don't know if you have a concluding thought or a final thing you'd like to share with our audience. We really are grateful for your time, and thank you for your investment in the dialogue and what you're bringing to it, and the hopes of a new level, a new layer of academic dialogue. I trust and pray will continue forward and will be launched at some point in the future. But I wanted to see if you had any final thought.
Yeah, well, I'm just so grateful for all of the trailblazing that you two have done in the years past, and I hope that it continues. We're very fortunate and blessed to be able to partner with your ministry. And like I said, if there's kind of a closing of chapter 1, I can't wait to see what's in chapter 2.
We are with you with that. Yeah.
Well, I will tell you, in what Jill is just saying, you know, there are a lot of new faces and new platforms that people are using, you know, certainly with the internet and YouTube pages and various things like that. And it's really fascinating to us. You know, I came to Utah in 1992 as a pastor with a background, but I certainly wasn't the only person ever thinking about these kinds of things and how to build relationships and build bridges and things like that. But there was a whole generation of people before me. Then I've kind of been in one, you know, I've followed in their path. And now we see new voices, new faces, new contributors to the dialogue. And it really is kind of a beautiful thing that this thing is, it gives me confidence that it really isn't just a human endeavor, that there's a God ordained, God favor over this effort. And I think the end results, whatever they are, long-term or short-term, are going to be his doing, not anybody individually, not one person or one idea or one organization. It's going to be a collective sense between both Latter-day Saints and evangelicals that there's a better way forward. There's a better way to know each other. There's a better way to work with one another. There's a better way to engage one another. And I think we don't have to worry, like, are you guys going to change? Are we going to change? Or who's going to change? I think to some degree we can just kind of walk in the way of God and continue to let these new relationships and continuization. Like, I only met Stephan just a couple years ago, probably 2 years ago, when he was still at UVU. And I'm thinking, this guy's awesome. You know, what a great heart, what a great mind, what a great spirit he has. And we have people like Jared Halverson, who's also recently hired at BYU, another great guy that we worked with for many years at the University of Utah Institute. And there's more than that. There's a lot more faces on both sides. So I think God's up to something through this. And again, it's not the only way. It's not the best way. It's just a way that I think God is honoring and blessing. And so we are excited about the future. And, you know, whether or not, you know, Jill and I kind of, when we got married back in 98, we kind of went to the state capitol of Utah and stood on the top of the steps and said, okay, God, we're giving you 40 years, 4 decades, plus whatever else of life you give us. But, you know, we figured at that time I'd be in my 70s and Jill would be, you know, right behind me. And so maybe if we live to 80, we can give him 5 decades, who knows? But we're just kind of throwing that out. And we're well past the halfway mark of that commitment to God, you know? So we only have another decade or two to kind of, I always say, when we're free to go pastor a church in Hawaii for the last 10 years of our lives or something. But no, who knows what's going to happen in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I think some good things are very possible that will be of God and blessed of God and really fruit of a lot of effort sown for many years.
I agree. I was talking to a friend and he asked, what do you think the Lord is up to in your life with this area? And I said, I don't know. That's not really my concern. My concern is that I would just step out of the Holy Spirit's way and follow. And so I pray that, at least from the evangelical side of things, that's where we would go. So.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Well, we want to thank you for checking in with us this month on Building Bridges with Greg and Jill, where we try to bring people together with different perspectives and backgrounds into conversations of respect and civility and kindness and love. And I think even though we only had Dr. Stephan Taeger, Traeger or Taeger? I always want to
Taeger.
No R. I always want to put an R in there, but it's Stephan Taeger. Even though he had to leave a little early, we appreciate both Dr. Kyle Beshears and Dr. Stephan Taeger for joining us in this conversation, and applaud them for their efforts and their relationship that is emerging and growing and could be something to build on in the future with another conversation among scholars of both traditions. So again, if you have any comments, fire away. Let us know. We'd love to see what you have to say. Kyle will be able to read those. Stephan will be able to read those as well, and they can respond and reply if they so choose. So anyways, pass this along to people and friends you think might be interested. Let people know, like, subscribe, and we are very, very grateful for your monthly viewership and listenership. We'll see you next month on Building Bridges with Greg and Jill. Thanks.